Hi! This is my response to this week's reading. So the books I read this week were Long Way Down and The Naturals. So why I made my selections was Long Way Down. I really was drawn to the cover. I was drawn specifically to the elevator buttons on the cover, and I thought it was spooky and mysterious and thought it was really a good read. And I also didn't like the description of the book that won the award, We Are You, so I decided to go one of the honor books instead. And a few of the honor books I had read before, so I wanted to go with something different. And like I said, I was really drawn to the cover art, and I really liked the description of the book. So for The Naturals, I liked the mini blurb about the book, and I wanted to read a murder mystery because that is the genre that I read 99% of the time. I love myself a murder mystery, even though I'm terrible at figuring out who the killer is or all that. I always think it's one thing, and then it actually turns out to be another thing, and I'm like, dang, I didn't see that one coming. And I also liked, with the description of the book, there was recommendations, and a lot of the recommendations stated that this book was a lot like TV shows Blacklist and Blind Spot, which I absolutely love both of those shows. So I was really interested to see if those recommendations were correct and that this book was similar to those shows. Some experiences and reactions for each of the books were Long Way Down. I was really, really disappointed at first. When I got the book and looked at the pages, I thought it was more poetry. And I was really upset because the description didn't say anything about poetry. But the style was poem-like, but I didn't have to read it as a poem. So it was just, you could read it just as normal sentences, which I enjoyed. And then once I figured out how to read the book, I absolutely loved it. The story was great, and the message that the book gave was very powerful, and I felt like could connect with a lot of people. Maybe not in an extreme like the book, but you could still relate it to different lives. One quote was, "Same letters, different words. Some things still make sense together, like brothers." The main character in the book, Will, he really likes to anagram. And so throughout the book, he did different anagrams, and it kind of went with him and his brother Sean, that they were both different people, but they're both related, and they still somehow connected. One of the favorite anagrams from the book was scare equals cares, which kind of relates to the whole book because the book was scary, but you could still you still get that caring aspect throughout the book. And the next one, the elevator rumbled and vibrated and knocked around like the middle drawer, like something off track. This one I picked because I actually absolutely hate elevators. I am deathly afraid of them because a few years ago I was actually stuck in an elevator for a little bit, and it gets me. I've tried to get back in them, but every time I hear a noise, I feel like it's getting off track, like the quote says, and I start getting a little panicky, and then I'm like, oh my god, the elevator's going to stop again. So I completely avoid them now, which kind of is interesting why I chose the book based on the elevator buttons when I know I'm terrified of elevators. With The Naturals, like I said, this is my usual genre, so I was glad that I enjoyed the book, and I also found out the book is a series, so because I liked the first book, I plan to read the rest of the series to figure out how it all ends. I was a little confused at first, because before each chapter, there is a note titled You that is supposed to be from the serial killer mindset throughout the whole book when the main character is trying to solve the crime. So what that means is that there's like a little paragraph or two that's titled You, and it's from the serial killer's point of view. And then the next chapter talks about how the main character, Cassie, is trying to figure out the clues of the serial killer to catch him. So he's basically talking to Cassie without actually talking to Cassie. And I actually love the book. It was different than an adult murder mystery, but I still enjoyed it a lot. Adult murder mystery, you get the blood and the gore, and with this one, it was more you didn't actually get the crime, you just got the after effects of it. And some quotes from this were people, but for better or worse, most days they were just puzzles to me. I felt like this related to like the general public, that people are always going to be people, and that there's going to be some people you get along with and there's going to be some people you don't get along with. And you have to figure out how to work with them. So you have to figure, it's like a puzzle. You need to figure out what traits you can work with and what traits you can't work with. I also liked Guy never met a square peg he didn't want to pound into a round hole. So I felt like this related to what we were talking about throughout the whole class, that one of the special agents, he didn't see adolescents as different. All adolescents were round pegs to him, and if you were a square peg, he wanted to try to fit you in that round hole. He wanted to try to put you in a group. And I felt like this went to the everyone's unique. That some people are square, some people are triangles, some people are round. That's just the way they are. So how I would use long way down in the classroom would be cause and effect. So there's a main event that happened at the beginning of the book, and then the rest of the book was the effect of that main event. And I also felt like actions have consequences also goes with it, because you have that main event, so which is action, and then the rest of the book was consequences from that. And it also went with revenge. Will felt like revenge was his only option to take justice into his own hands for his brother's death. And I felt like this also could be used if bullying was happening in school, because it would show that revenge isn't the only option for bullying, that you should try to tell someone. And just like Will should have told someone about his feelings before he went on and acted on his revenge. The story had a lot of like ghost aspects to it, so you could give ghost stories in the classroom. Violence, it played a main part in the story, and you could talk about how the main character Will wanted to go with violence, but you could talk with the class about what was his other options besides violence. And following rules was a big part throughout the book. Will had rules that he lived by through his life that was passed down from his brother and his older brother and his father, just like street rules, like number 1, you can't cry, number 2, you can't snitch, number 3, you get revenge. And then he talks about there's elevator rules, like number 1, in an elevator most people don't talk, which from when I was in an elevator is true. Unless you know the person, you don't really talk to the person. You usually keep your head in your cell phone, or you look the other direction. How I would use the naturals in the classroom would be, I felt like it would really be good for the plot development pyramid. Like it had a lot of action, it had suspense, it had details. It really would be able to describe that and illustrate that for the students really well. And I thought about looking for details in the text versus inferences. So like the students would have to find the details of the killer instead of making their inferences about who was the killer. And then students could work on their problem solving and critical thinking skills to try to figure out who the killer is. And that went with my literacy prompt, which would be write about who they think the killer is, and the students would have to support their answer with evidence from the book. And like me, if you're really bad at figuring out who the killer is, you could have a wide variety. As long as they supported their answer with evidence from the book, that would work. And then when they found out they were wrong, they could think back and using their critical thinking to figure out why they were wrong. So positive literacy development for Long Way Down was, I felt like Will could be a relatable character. Will experienced a lot of death in his life, and he dealt with that death in different ways, which I felt like in real life, adolescents, could experience death, and they could deal with it different ways too. So I thought Will could help them realize the right way to deal with it. And then imagine what they would have done in the same situation and write about it. So if you were in Will's situation, would you have done the same thing he did, or would you have done something differently? And this kind of goes along with the pros and cons discussion. It would have to talk about like the pros and cons of Will's decision, and then the pros and cons of doing something different. I felt like the book was had a wide range of appeal and would go with a lot of different level readers because the format was so different. It really wasn't challenging to read. With the Naturals, I felt like that anyone could relate to the main character, Cassie. Her mother disappeared, her father had never been in the picture, which left her with an overbearing, overprotective family. So maybe an adolescent doesn't have all those aspects, but maybe an adolescent has an overprotective family, or they don't really know their dad. That could be one way they could relate to the character. Another thing was Cassie was selected for her special skills. So some people are selected for their special skills. So if you're good at football, if you're good at hockey, if you're good at music, you know that those are your skills, and you know that those are what you are going to be picked for in life. I felt like the book encouraged discussions to try to figure out who the killer actually was and figure out all the details and clues. And it went with a wide range of appeal and level of readers again. Adolescents' response for A Long Way Down, I think they would be confused at first because of the style of the work, but then they would really enjoy and really get into the message of the book. With Naturals, they would like the book and be interested in reading the rest of the series, which is good because I feel like the first book is really intense and really brings you in, and then you're interested in reading the rest of it. And also the author keeps the reader guessing about who the serial killer is until the end. And mind you, I'm really terrible at that, but I still feel like the author does a good job at keeping that aspect a secret until the end. So connections to journals. So for the first one, I felt like it had to do with like the dream aspect, that there isn't always a right answer, that it still has to do with students dreaming and figuring out what could be other options. It's not always black and white, there is a gray in the middle. And the next two kind of have to go with like assuming that there was violence in the book and like the main character wanted to take revenge on his brother's death. So it's teachers assuming that students will read about that violence and want to do that, which is not the case. And I felt like that kind of went with the last quote about being a safe text. Because there was violence in the book, maybe teachers wouldn't use this in the classroom, but I feel like the message and the benefits from the book would outweigh that fact. With the Naturals, I felt like the first quote goes with my round and square peg thing, that all adolescents are different, and that it's important that everyone understands that in the book, Cassie is different than another character, Dean, even though they're both natural profilers, they're still very different in themselves. And then the next one is, I felt like the Naturals involved a lot of discussion, and I felt like that was one thing that both books were good about, is that it provided discussions that could happen in the classroom to help students figure out things.